What if I told you that the greatest land power of antiquity not only won at sea, but completely rewrote the rules of naval warfare? The Roman Republic, with no maritime tradition to speak of, challenged Carthage, the master of the Mediterranean, whose ships had dominated all waterways for centuries. In just a few months, Rome not only built a fleet from scratch, but also created an innovation that turned naval combat into land combat, making it understandable and convenient for its legions. Watch the video to the end to find out how the Roman Navy invented a completely new way of waging war on water based on ingenious engineering. Are you ready to learn how a land-based nation was able to defeat an empire that lived by the sea? At the beginning of the First Punic War, Rome was a land power whose strength relied on disciplined, invincible legions, and the sea itself was seen as nothing more than an unfriendly space. All of their experience in navigation was limited to small merchant ships that were no match for Carthage's formidable military galleys. Until that moment, all Roman military thinking had been focused on building roads, fortifications, and infantry tactics. They knew perfectly well how to capture a city, but had no idea how to take control of the Mediterranean Sea. For them, war was a battle for territory, decided by a single general land battle, while the Carthaginians viewed it as control over trade routes and supplies. However, the capture of Sicily, a rich and strategically important island, became impossible without complete superiority at sea. The Romans quickly realized that their invincible legions would remain locked on the shore as long as Carthage controlled the waters. Thus, the very strategy of war demanded the impossible from Rome: to create a fleet capable of opposing the centuries-old naval experience of its enemy. This task was akin to building an airplane without ever seeing blueprints or having any aeronautical engineers. Their entire maritime culture was reduced to nothing, and Carthaginian ships seemed to them to be examples of unattainable technological superiority. Initially, the Romans tried to hire Greek and Italian sailors, but their skills were insufficient against the battle-hardened Carthaginian crews. Repeated defeats in minor skirmishes showed that borrowing someone else's experience would not help, and that they needed to come up with something of their own. Roman consuls and senators could not afford defeat, and so political will overcame technological skepticism. A radical decision was made to build a large military fleet as quickly as possible, even if it meant using raw and untrained crews. This moment became a turning point in history when Rome's pride and ambition collided with the harsh reality of naval warfare. They realized that in order to win, they would have to not just copy their enemy, but invent a completely new type of warfare in which their superiority on land could be applied on water. It was at this critical moment, when the fate of Sicily seemed sealed, that Rome made its most daring and ingenious move. They did not try to learn the skillful maneuvering and ramming tactics for which Carthage was famous. Instead, they decided to completely change the very nature of naval warfare by eliminating the element in which they were weak: seamanship. They abandoned the traditional philosophy that the sea belonged to experienced sailors. Legend has it that the key to this invention was a captured or washed-up Carthaginian pentera or quinquereme. Roman engineers dismantled this trophy down to the last plank, studying its design and assembly principles. It was a masterful demonstration of Roman pragmatism. They were not shy about learning from their enemies, but they did so with one goal in mind: to surpass them. This allowed them to begin mass production of ships based on a ready-made model, bypassing the long stage of trial and error. The rapid pace of fleet construction was in itself a miracle of logistics and organization. All of Italy was set in motion. Forests were cut down, logs were harvested, and thousands of craftsmen were mobilized. There had never been a case in history where an entire nation without a fleet had created a combat-ready armada in a matter of months. To the Carthaginians, this must have seemed like absurd but dangerous overconfidence. While the fleet was being built, the legionaries who were to serve on these ships underwent unprecedented training. They practiced rowing on special benches installed on land, imitating the movement on water. This shows their approach. Even in the absence of the sea, they found a land-based way to train, which was absolutely in their style. They did not learn to be sailors. They learned to be rowers and marines. This huge construction program and land-based training formed the basis of a new understanding of naval warfare. The Romans had no intention of fighting Carthage by its rules. They were going to impose their own, using their main strength, trained, disciplined, and well-armed legions. It was this philosophy that led them to create their famous engineering marvel. The realization that they would be the first in history to combine land and sea combat was the impetus for a unique engineering idea. The Romans understood that if they could not defeat the enemy at sea through maneuvering, they would have to move the battlefield to the deck. This was not just a tactical maneuver, but a fundamental change in the paradigm of naval warfare. It is interesting to see how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world. Where are you from? Do you agree with the arguments presented about the role of logistics at the beginning of the war? Share your opinion in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Want to know the main secret of how the Romans built their first fleet in just 60 days? Before creating its secret weapon, Rome had to solve a more basic but no less difficult task: learning how to build large warships. The Carthaginian and Greek fleets were based on quincunarams or penteres, which represented the pinnacle of shipbuilding at the time. The Romans did not know how to build them and did not have enough specialists, which called into question the very possibility of their naval program. It was at this moment that fortune smiled on them in the form of an enemy ship washed ashore. According to legend, this Carthaginian ship was captured or discovered after a storm and became an invaluable trophy for the Romans. It was not only repaired, but also carefully studied by Roman engineers, who were masters of reverse engineering. They dismantled the structure, studied the rowing system and the basic proportions, which gave them a ready-made template for mass production of their fleet. This was not an act of plagiarism, but a pragmatic step that saved Rome years of experimentation and failed projects. Based on this single model, the Romans were able to launch the production of more than 100 identical ships in an incredibly short time. It was a striking demonstration of their organizational genius and ability to mobilize resources and labor to achieve their goals. Construction was carried out in several ports simultaneously, and the entire system was built on the principle of a conveyor belt, anticipating industrial methods. The quality of these first ships may have been inferior to those of Carthage, but their number and speed of construction came as a shock to the enemy. While the ships were being built, intensive recruitment and training of crews was underway. The Romans could not afford the luxury of years of training for sailors, so they relied on numbers and discipline. The crews consisted mainly of allies and mercenaries who had to perform one simple task: row in rhythm as directed by the commander. This approach was unconventional, as naval combat required the individual skill of rowers and helmsmen. But the Romans replaced skill with brute force and coordination. The discipline of the legionaries was transferred to the fleet. Unlike the Carthaginian crews, who were mercenaries, Roman sailors and soldiers were subject to a strict hierarchy and were fully responsible for their actions. This compensated for their lack of experience and ensured that the crew would not scatter at the first sign of danger in battle. Roman commanders, not being sea dogs, managed the fleet according to land rules. Naval training, as already mentioned, took place on land, which was very typical for the Romans. The rowers sat on wooden benches, imitating the deck, and trained to row synchronously under command. This ensured that when the ships were launched, the basic coordination of rowing would already be worked out. It was this land-based training that allowed them to avoid the chaos typical of inexperienced crews. The first naval battles with Carthage, despite the speed of the fleet's construction, still ended unsuccessfully for Rome. In the Battle of Lipari, the Carthaginians, using their maneuverability advantage, were able to defeat the Roman vanguard, showing that numbers alone were not enough. This defeat was a harsh but important lesson, forcing the Romans to understand that without a change in tactics, they could not win. It was this bitter experience of defeat that convinced Roman strategists that they could not defeat Carthage at their own game. The art of ramming and maneuvering at sea. It became clear that trying to copy the enemy and compete in pure seamanship was doomed to failure. The only way out was to create a tool that would completely eliminate ramming from the equation of naval combat. Thus, the captured ship gave them form, but not tactics. They built ships, but did not learn how to fight with them. The need for tactical superiority which could be ensured by the strength of the legions, became the main task of Roman military genius. All the conditions for invention were in place. There was a fleet, there were soldiers, but there was no victory. It was this lack of experience in naval combat that led to the birth of the legendary crow, which changed the rules of the game. But what if I told you that even food could serve a completely unexpected function and not just satisfy hunger? Read on to the next chapter to find out how the Romans turned their main resource into a weapon of victory at sea. Guess how long it took to create this unique weapon that changed the history of naval warfare? The most important and revolutionary invention brought by the Roman fleet was the boarding bridge known as the Corvus, or crow. It was not just a weapon, but an ingenious technical solution that transformed naval battles from a duel between ships into a duel between land armies. Its entire design was developed to completely neutralize the skills of Carthaginian sailors and impose conditions favorable to the Roman legionaries. The Raven was a long bridge about 1 meter wide and 11 meters long, fixed to the bow of the ship. It was attached to a vertical mast and could rotate 180 degrees, allowing it to be aimed at an enemy ship from any angle. At the end of the bridge was a heavy, sharp metal spike, which gave the device its name. This spike resembled a beak that dug into the deck of the enemy ship. The principle of operation was extremely simple and effective. When a Carthaginian ship approached for a ramming attack or maneuvering, the Roman ship lowered its Raven. The spike dug into the enemy's deck with a crash, firmly locking the two ships together. Thus, any skill of the Carthaginian helmsman in maneuvering and evading became meaningless, as the ship was tied to the Roman one. Once the bridge was secured, the legionaries, who were Rome's main force, sprang into action. Disciplined and heavily armed, they instantly crossed the bridge onto the enemy's deck. For them, it was the same as storming a fortress wall, in which they were unmatched. In a matter of minutes, the numerical and tactical superiority of the Roman infantry decided the outcome of the naval battle in hand-to-hand combat. This came as a real shock to the Carthaginians, as their entire naval combat tactics were based on speed, maneuverability, and ramming. They were not prepared for hand-to-hand combat on deck, where the Roman legionaries had an overwhelming advantage in armor, weaponry, and fighting spirit. Carthaginian sailors were mostly lightly armed mercenaries, not heavy infantry, which made them powerless against the Romans. For the first time in the history of naval warfare, the outcome of a battle was determined not by naval skill, but by the strength of the infantry. This was a real revolution in military science, demonstrating how an engineering solution could completely change strategy. Rome did not learn naval warfare. It forced naval warfare to become similar to land warfare. It was this ingenious adaptation that allowed them to quickly catch up. The use of the Corvus brought Rome its first major naval victory at Malis in 260 BC. The Roman consul Gaius Duilius, who had no previous naval experience, defeated the Carthaginian fleet using only this new invention. The legions, using the crows, boarded one Carthaginian ship after another. This victory not only secured Rome's control over Sicily, but also instilled confidence in its own fleet. However, the crow had one significant drawback, which ultimately led to its gradual disappearance. This device was very heavy, and its installation high on the bow of the ship greatly affected stability. In heavy storms, the weight of the bridge made ships vulnerable and could even cause them to capsize. It was this design risk that ultimately forced the Romans to abandon their great invention. Despite its short existence, the Raven has forever remained a symbol of Roman military genius. It showed that military success can be achieved not only through superior skill, but also through game-changing innovations. Without this invention, Rome's victory over Carthage would have been unthinkable. It was a unique secret that showed that land soldiers could win at sea if given the right tool. Like this video if you think the Raven was one of the most ingenious inventions in the history of ancient warfare. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. What you are about to learn will change your perception of the Roman military machine. The mass construction and successful deployment of the fleet would have been impossible without the unique Roman system of organization and logistics. Unlike Carthage, where the fleet was the preserve of merchant clans and mercenaries, Rome subjected the fleet to state, discipline, and resources. The main principle was the complete subordination of the naval program to the land command, which ensured the effective use of legionary force. Supplying a huge fleet at sea was an unprecedented task for a state accustomed to land routes. Ships needed constant supplies of provisions, water, new masts, sails, and, most importantly, trained rowers. Rome created an extensive network of naval bases along the coasts of Italy and Sicily, which served as supply, repair, and rest points for crews. These bases were equipped with shipyards, warehouses, and barracks. The Roman fleet management system was extremely centralized. The fleet was under the direct command of the consuls, who were primarily land generals, which often led to disasters due to their inexperience in naval affairs. However, this ensured the ideal integration of the fleet into the overall war strategy, where naval operations always served the goals of the legions. It was the political leadership that determined the objectives of the fleet. To provide the fleet with rowers and crews, Rome used the resources of its allies and conquered peoples, especially the Greek cities of southern Italy. These allies, obliged to provide ships and men, became the main workforce of the fleet. This approach allowed Rome not to take its citizens away from agriculture and service in the legions. The maintenance of ships was no less important than their construction. Wooden ships rotted quickly in salt water and were often damaged due to rough handling and poor stability caused by crows. The Romans built numerous slipways and dry docks, where ships could be quickly lifted out of the water for repairs and treatment of their hulls with resin. The speed of repairs was critical. The Roman logistics chain provided not only ships, but also the soldiers on board. Legionnaires who served in the Navy as Marines required the same food and supplies as the land forces. This meant that large quantities of grain, wine, weapons, and armor had to be transported by sea. The organization of these maritime convoys became an important part of naval strategy in itself. Rome used special escort ships to protect these convoys. These convoys were often attacked by Carthaginian light ships attempting to disrupt supply lines. Thus, the Roman fleet performed a dual function. It conducted direct combat operations and protected vital transport arteries. Without uninterrupted supplies, the legions in Sicily would not have been able to hold out. Despite all organizational efforts, Roman maritime logistics often failed due to inexperience in navigation and the arrogance of the command. Underestimating the forces of nature and disregarding the advice of experienced sailors often led to the loss of entire armadas in storms. Nevertheless, each time after a disaster, Rome rebuilt its fleet with incredible speed. The constant rebuilding of the fleet after losses became a symbol of Rome's unyielding will. Their strength lay not in invincibility, but in their ability to mobilize instantly and make up for losses, which was unthinkable for Carthage. They turned defeat into an incentive that strengthened their resolve. It was this organizational genius and ability to mobilize resources, inherited from the land empire, that allowed Rome to become a maritime power. The organization of the fleet was a reflection of the power of the Roman state itself. But even the most cunning trail is useless if your pursuers have water. In the next chapter, you will learn how the Romans turned their warships into veritable floating fortresses, capable of withstanding any assault. Roman quinqueremes, modeled after Carthaginian ships, were completely adapted to the special Roman style of warfare. While the Carthaginians made their ships light and fast for maneuvering and ramming, the Romans deliberately sacrificed speed in favor of strength. Their ships became heavier and stronger to withstand boarding and carry large numbers of marines. This was a conscious transition from pure seafaring to combat platforms capable of becoming arenas for hand-to-hand combat. The Romans understood that the strength of their army at sea was determined not only by maneuverability, but also by the number of fighters on deck. Every change in the design of the ship reflected their strategic approach to naval warfare. The quinquereme, with 5 rows of oarsmen, was the most common type of large warship. Its deck housed an impressive marine infantry unit, usually up to 120 legionaries, in addition to the crew of rowers and sailors. This was a key difference from Carthaginian ships, which could not carry such a large number of infantry. The increased crew allowed the Romans to use the strength of the legionaries on deck for a decisive boarding. In addition, the large number of people ensured faster organization of battle formations and protection against enemy attempts to break through to the ship. Thus, the Roman quinquereme became not just a means of transport, but a combat platform for effective warfare. The installation of a heavy crow on the bow of the ship required significant changes in design. To compensate for the additional weight and maintain stability, the ships were made wider and with a deeper draft than their Carthaginian counterparts. This improved stability on the waves and allowed them to stand side by side with the enemy, but at the same time reduce speed and maneuverability. In pure naval combat, such ships were slower and less able to evade attacks. However, the Romans deliberately chose strength and the ability to board instead of speed. Each decision was dictated by a strategic goal: to turn a naval battle into a direct clash of infantry. Roman ships had very strong hulls, capable of withstanding not only ramming blows, but also prolonged contact with enemy ships during boarding. The hull was reinforced with additional ties and thicker planks to avoid punctures and deformations. This was critical as the main tactic involved close contact between ships, side by side. Even when struck and rocked, the ships retained their shape and allowed the fighters to operate on deck. Such strength turned the quinquereme into a veritable floating fortress capable of withstanding prolonged combat. While the Carthaginians sought minimum weight for maximum speed, the Romans chose reliability and stability. The philosophy of Roman shipbuilding coincided with their architectural doctrine. Strength, durability, and functionality were valued above external elegance or speed. Their ships were more like floating platforms for legions than sea predators capable of lightning-fast maneuvers. This allowed them to concentrate as many infantry as possible on deck and fight in conditions they considered optimal. The Romans saw naval warfare as a continuation of land warfare, where the number of fighters was of key importance. The rowing system, borrowed from the Carthaginians, was adapted to the Roman approach to organizing labor. The synchrony of rowing was maintained not by the individual skill of each rower, but through strict rhythmic commands given by officers. This allowed for the use of fewer experienced but more numerous rowers, turning each person into part of a large mechanism. The coordinated work of all rows ensured the necessary speed and maneuverability despite the heavy hull. Each rower was a cog in a powerful machine, and team discipline made even a large ship controllable. In addition to quinqueremes, the Romans also built lighter ships, such as triremes, which were used for reconnaissance, patrolling, and pursuing the enemy. But the main weapon remained large, heavy ships with a crow and a full infantry detachment. This emphasized the strategic priority. Victory was achieved by the strength of the Marines, not by maneuvering on the water. Light ships played a supporting role, providing reconnaissance and communication, while heavy ships decided the outcome of battles. This approach allowed the Romans to control combat zones and exploit their numerical and structural advantages. The design features of Roman ships included more protected superstructures to accommodate Marines. These superstructures gave legionaries a height advantage when throwing spears and arrows in preparation for boarding. The ship was transformed into a floating tower from which the enemy's deck could be effectively fired upon. The superstructures protected the soldiers from direct hits and provided tactical superiority in hand-to-hand combat. Each design improvement was aimed at increasing survivability and combat effectiveness. Over time, as the need for the Corvus diminished, Roman engineers gradually improved the speed characteristics of their ships. They reduced weight, optimized the hull lines, and made the ships more maneuverable. However, the initial emphasis on strength and the deployment of large numbers of infantry remained the hallmark of the Roman fleet. These ships continued to be the backbone of naval strategy, demonstrating a combination of strength, discipline, and engineering skill. Thus, Roman ships were the embodiment of the empire's military doctrine: adapt enemy technology, reinforce it with infantry, and turn naval combat into a land battle on water. Quinqueremes and other heavy ships were not just ships, but floating fortresses, bringing destruction and fear to the enemy. They symbolized Rome's approach to war. The strength of infantry, discipline, and engineering skill are more important than agility and speed. Each ship was designed for victory and to serve as a platform for Roman military power. Are you ready to learn how boarding became the basis of naval warfare? The Roman Marines, consisting of selected legionaries, were the most formidable weapon of the Roman fleet. These soldiers were trained not in seamanship, but in land combat, and it was their presence on board ships that completely changed the outcome of battles. This was a deliberate strategic move. Instead of creating a fleet capable of maneuvering, Rome created a fleet capable of transporting legions. The Marines were recruited from the best units of the legions and had the same weapons and protection as their land-based comrades. Heavy armor, a large scutum shield, and pilum-throwing spears made them unbeatable in close combat. Unlike the lightly armed Carthaginian crews, the Romans were a wall of steel and shields. Their training included special exercises in quickly descending the boarding bridge and instantly forming ranks on the enemy's deck. The discipline and coordination of the legion allowed them to transition from rowing to battle formation in a matter of seconds. On the enemy deck, they acted as they would on solid ground. They formed ranks and began a methodical advance. It was the pilum, the Roman throwing spear, that played a huge role in naval combat. Before engaging in hand-to-hand combat, the legionaries rained a hail of spears down on the enemy deck, piercing the sailors' light armor and sowing panic. On a crowded deck, this volley was particularly devastating, causing enormous damage. The boarding tactic allowed the Romans to use their strengths, the individual skill of the legionary in close combat, and the ability to maintain battle order under pressure. Carthaginian ships, even if they were more maneuverable, could not withstand the onslaught of such infantry. The entire Carthaginian philosophy of combat was based on avoiding contact, while the Romans imposed it. To ensure superiority in hand-to-hand combat, the Romans often took more soldiers on board than were necessary for defense. Their goal was not only to capture the ship, but also to completely destroy or capture the crew in order to deprive Carthage of experienced sailors. It was a strategy of attrition based on the numerical superiority of the infantry. Even after the crowbar was abandoned, boarding tactics remained central to the Roman navy. Legionnaires began to use simpler and lighter boarding hooks and ropes to quickly pull ships together. Although this was not as effective as the crow, it allowed ships to remain stable. It was a compromise between naval skill and infantry strength. For the Carthaginians, the loss of a ship meant the loss of trained sailors and an expensive vessel. For the Romans, it was only the loss of wood, which they could quickly replace, as their soldiers were versatile. This gave Rome a huge advantage in a war of attrition. Service in the navy was considered less prestigious in Rome than in the legions, but the Marines always retained their high status thanks to their origins in the legions. Their courage and professionalism at sea were highly valued. They were an elite force capable of transferring the rules of land warfare to the water. In the end, it was the naval legionaries, not the sailors, who won the First Punic War for Rome. They proved that even the most complex art can be reduced to a simple formula: deliver the infantry into close combat. How many modern people do you think would be able to make a candle with their own hands? The command of the Roman fleet was unique and reflected the absolute priority of land forces in Roman military doctrine. The fleet was commanded by consuls or praetors, who were supreme magistrates and military leaders, but as a rule had absolutely no experience in maritime affairs. This was in stark contrast to Carthaginian admirals, who were hereditary sailors who had dedicated their lives to the sea. The appointment of land generals as fleet commanders had both advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, it ensured the seamless integration of naval operations into the overall war strategy, allowing the fleet to operate in close coordination with the legions. On the other hand, it often led to disasters, as the consuls were unable to read the weather, did not understand the currents, and disregarded the advice of experienced pilots. Naval command in Rome was divided into two levels. The highest level consisted of political and military leaders who made strategic decisions and led the fleet into battle. The lower level consisted of professional pilots, gubernatores, and captains, navarchi, who were Greeks or Italians and directly commanded the ships. The pilots were the only ones who truly knew the sea. They were responsible for navigation, maneuvering, and the safety of the ship. However, in battle, their voices were often drowned out by the orders of Roman officers, who believed more in the strength of the legions than in the art of navigation. This led to ships being lost in storms due to errors in navigation. In the early period of the wars with Carthage, the lack of maritime experience among commanders was particularly critical. Rome's greatest losses were not caused by Carthaginian rams, but by storms that the consuls were unable to foresee or avoid. Historians note that Roman commanders often led their fleets into battle or on voyages without paying attention to unfavorable weather forecasts. The reward system was also geared toward land combat. Triumphs were awarded for victories, and naval victories achieved through boarding were considered as honorable as those on land. This encouraged consuls to employ tactics in which they could use their main strength, the legionaries. Over time, especially after numerous disasters, the Romans began to pay more attention to the experience of pilots and gradually separated naval officers into a separate category. However, even in the late Republican Empire, supreme command of the fleet almost always remained in the hands of civilian or military officials from the senatorial or equestrian classes. This command system demonstrates the main difference between Roman naval warfare and that of others. For Carthage, the sea was home, and its admirals were its sons. For Rome, the sea was merely an extension of the battlefield, and its commanders were simply generals temporarily transferred to a floating platform. The long-term success of the Roman fleet depended not only on victories on the open sea, but also on its ability to ensure uninterrupted navigation and supply. This was a colossal task that required incredible organization on the part of the Roman administration. The fleet was inextricably linked to logistics, which were as important as combat itself. Navigation in those days was rudimentary and based on coastal sailing and visual landmarks. Roman ships rarely ventured far from shore, preferring routes where they could easily find shelter in case of a storm or go ashore to rest. This made their routes predictable but safe for inexperienced crews. After its initial victories, the fleet's main role was to protect grain convoys traveling from Sicily and Africa to Italy. The Roman capital depended on food supplies, and interruptions in supply could lead to famine and political instability. Protecting these convoys became a strategic task that required the constant presence of warships on the sea lanes. The supply system for the fleet on long-distance routes was based on mobile bases and floating warehouses. Military ships often accompanied transport vessels loaded with provisions and water. When the fleet was on a long voyage, it had to stop regularly at predetermined points to replenish its supplies. One of the most difficult logistical tasks was providing fresh water to the rowers. In the Mediterranean, where supplies ran out quickly, each ship was forced to spend valuable time stopping to replenish its water supplies. Knowing this, the Carthaginians often set up ambushes at freshwater sources on the coast. The Romans introduced strict discipline in the use of supplies. The rations of rowers and marines were strictly regulated, and officers were responsible for controlling supplies. This discipline, typical of the legions, was transferred to the navy, which made it possible to avoid the chaos and hunger characteristic of mercenary crews. During the Second Punic War, the role of the fleet became even more strategic. It not only defended Italy, but also blockaded Hannibal, preventing him from receiving reinforcements and supplies from Carthage. Control of the sea became not an end in itself, but a means to achieve victory on land. Thus, the Roman fleet became not just a fighting force, but also a crucial element of the logistical infrastructure. Rome's ability to mobilize, supply, and quickly rebuild its fleet after losses ultimately depleted the resources of Carthage, which could not afford such large-scale and rapid losses. After Rome established its dominance at sea and undermined Carthage's naval power, the need for the heavy and risky Corvus gradually disappeared. The Romans realized that their main advantages, discipline and numerical superiority, could be exploited without this device, and its design flaws had become too dangerous. This led to the evolution of Roman naval tactics. The abandonment of the Corvus was primarily caused by a series of disasters in which entire fleets were lost in storms. The weight and instability of the bridge made ships too vulnerable to Mediterranean winds. Roman strategists realized that the loss of hundreds of ships due to weather conditions outweighed the tactical advantage in battle. After abandoning the boarding bridge, the Romans gradually returned to more traditional methods of naval combat based on ramming and maneuvering. However, their approach remained unique. They did not follow Carthaginian tactics, but created their own hybrid style. Now that Roman ships had become lighter, they could use the ram more effectively. A ram strike aimed at the side of an enemy ship was supposed to pierce its hull and sink it. This required a high level of skill from the rowers and helmsmen, which the Romans gradually acquired. However, even without the crow, boarding did not disappear from the Roman arsenal. Instead of a cumbersome bridge, they began to use ordinary boarding hooks and throwing anchors to pull enemy ships closer. This approach was more flexible and did not require complex construction, but still allowed legionaries to be used in hand-to-hand combat. Improving rowing skills became a priority. The Romans began to recruit and train more professional crews, and discipline on board was strengthened. They realized that victory in pure naval combat required not only strength, but also speed and accuracy. At the same time, the Romans actively used throwing machines installed on the decks of their ships. Ballistas and catapults could fire at enemy ships from a distance, damaging the crew and destroying superstructures. This was another manifestation of land tactics at sea. The war with Carthage taught Rome that naval warfare requires flexibility. They learned to combine ramming, projectile weapon fire, and boarding, creating a tactic that was much more versatile than the traditional, one-sided Carthaginian approach. In the end, abandoning the Corvus was not an admission of defeat, but a sign of maturity. The Romans proved that they could win not only by force, but also by skill, reserving the right to innovate. They created a new standard for naval combat that became the basis for all subsequent Mediterranean fleets. After the final victory over Carthage and the establishment of control over the Mediterranean, the role of the Roman fleet changed dramatically. It ceased to be the main fighting force aimed at destroying large enemy fleets and became an instrument for maintaining peace and order. The basis of Pax Romana. The fleet became a police force guarding trade routes. The main task of the fleet during the empire was to combat piracy, which flourished in coastal waters and threatened grain supplies to Rome. Roman squadrons patrolled the Mediterranean, Adriatic, and Black Seas, ensuring the safety of merchant ships. This no longer required large-scale battles, but rather constant, methodical patrols. The fleet was divided into several permanent flotillas, the two largest of which were based in Misenum, in the west, and Ravenna in the east. These flotillas became permanent naval bases, housing ships, crews, and marines. Service in the Navy became professional and less prestigious than in the legions. The composition of the fleet itself also changed. Large and heavy quinquereme gradually gave way to lighter and faster ships, such as liburns and triremes. These ships were better suited for patrolling, pursuing pirates, and reconnaissance. Speed and maneuverability became more important than frontal attacks. The Marines retained their importance, but were now used mainly for amphibious operations, storming pirate strongholds and fighting small units on the coast. Legionaries on ships were now a tool for rapid intervention rather than the main striking force in line combat. The Roman fleet also played an important role in supporting the land legions, ensuring their rapid deployment to the borders of the empire, especially on the Rhine, Danube, and in Britain. River flotillas became an integral part of border garrisons, delivering supplies and conducting patrols. It was a logistical highway. Roman domination of the sea was so complete that it went down in history as the Roman Lake. The entire Mediterranean region was completely open to trade and communication, which was the key to the empire's economic prosperity. The fleet was the guarantor of this peace, ensuring stability for centuries. Thus, the Roman fleet completed its cycle. Starting as the inventor of aggressive, land-based warfare at sea, it ended as an instrument of global peace. It proved that for a great empire, a fleet must be above all functional and flexible, capable of performing both combat and logistical tasks. We have traced the incredible journey of the Roman Navy, which began with absurd arrogance and ended with complete control of the Mediterranean. The Romans did not simply defeat a maritime power, they reinvented naval warfare, turning it into a logical continuation of land warfare. The invention of the Corvus became a symbol of their genius, and their organizational power allowed them to replenish their losses at a speed that Carthage could not even dream of. The history of the Roman fleet teaches us that the strongest opponent is not the one with the most experience, but the one who is willing to change the rules of the game by using their strengths. Rome did not become the best sailor, it became the best engineer and organizer, and that proved to be enough to win. Their legacy is not only about warships, but also about how the will of the state and pragmatism can overcome any technological backwardness. They proved that genius is not about doing something new, but about doing something familiar in a different way. Which of the Romans' tactical innovations do you find most impressive? Was it the ingenious Corvus that turned the sea into a battlefield for the legionaries, or their incredible ability to rebuild their fleet after catastrophic storms? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new exciting research into military history.